All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Reza Jenkins, and I'm the Vice President of Asset Management at Pure Energy for the Renewables Division. Pure Energy is a subsidiary of NACE, and I'm excited to be the moderator this afternoon for our session on the implications of the IRA on clean energy financing. I know this is going to be a robust discussion with all our wonderful panelists, so I'll be asking some questions, and I encourage you to ask some questions as well. All right, so on the stage with me today, I have John Beebe. John is a member of JP Morgan's Green Economy Banking Team, delivering the full capabilities of JP Morgan to renewable energy developers, operators, and equipment manufacturers. John has spent most of his career focused on renewable energy project financing, both from the developer side and financing side. John joined JP Morgan in 2021 to lead the build-out of the renewables project financing capabilities within the firm's commercial bank. Next, we have Doug Beebe, no relation to John. Doug is Vice President of Clean Energy at Key Equipment Finance, a subsidiary of Key Corp, among the nation's largest well-capitalized banks. He is responsible for originating, analyzing, structuring, and closing financing for solar, fuel cell, energy storage, energy efficiency, and other clean energy transitions. And next we have Bonnie Lind. Bonnie has been engaged in the energy space for over 20 years. At Brown & Brown, Inc., she's part of the Global Power and Climate Technologies team, providing risk solutions to enable deployment of new climate products and the expansion of green energy. She's been involved in the integration of new technology in the energy space, from the first wind farm in New England, to the first utility-scale battery, to the first distributed energy resource provider virtual power plant in California. Additionally, Bonnie has a breadth of knowledge across the industry in finance, asset management, public policy, and development. And Gage Mooring is the co-founder of Renewa. He serves as a co-CEO and leads Renewa's renewable land and royalty acquisition strategy. Prior to Renewa, Gage successfully founded and built Renewa's predecessor company, Paloma Solar and Wind. So I'm excited to have everyone here. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, so I just want to give some high-level information about the IRA. So let's start. It went dark in here. All right, so the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, or the IRA, was the federal legislation passed in 2022 to curb inflation by reducing the federal government budget deficit and addressing issues with the tax code. It also was lowering healthcare and prescription and drug costs. But the real reason why we're here is to discuss the area in which it's focused on this conference and session, which is investing in domestic energy production while promoting clean energy. So there were a number of areas that the IRA promoted for clean energy. Some of the areas include extending the investment tax credit and the production tax credits, appropriating $11.7 billion for new loans, and added the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program to help retool, repower, repurpose, or replace energy infrastructure that it ceased operation to improve the efficiency or infrastructure of that is currently operating. It also created grant programs such as the Environmental Injustice Grant, Climate and Justice Grant. It also increased in access and participation for low-income communities with clean energy. And finally, it supported workforce programs through incentives for employers who pay prevailing wages, employ registered apprentices. So to start this discussion, I think we'll start with some of our panelists who work in the financing space. So I guess, John, how about you share your experience as someone who's been supporting renewable projects through financing, and talk about a little bit more about the work that you do at JP Morgan.
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking from the slides because bankers love arts and crafts on slides, and so you can read it, but I'm not going to speak a ton to it. This is really a summary of what Reza was mentioning. There were a ton of incentives specifically for renewables and for the clean ecosystem more broadly that came through the IRA. I think, if my numbers are correct, it was $369 billion of incentives specifically for renewables. and most of that came through the tax credit regime. So Riza had focused on or touched on the fact there were credits, guarantees, adders, and grants kind of in the form of a direct pay from the government as an incentive for investment. The adders, that's an adder to a tax credit, and so if you have a 30% tax credit on your investment in a solar project, if you're developing your project in a specific geography or with specific attributes, you could get a higher percentage tax credit. So just by raise of hands, students in the room, just so okay, awesome. Tip off is in an hour, so we'll be done. So the high level is the IRA was a windfall of investment and capital flowing into specifically the renewables industry. And that manifested itself in a number of ways. And for all technologies for renewables, traditional renewables, if there was such a thing, solar, wind, storage, getting into hydrogen, nuclear, carbon capture, that's both direct air capture and point source capture. Direct air is sucking carbon out of the air. Point source capture is capturing carbon from an emission source. And so it was just, again, a windfall of capital specifically for the renewables industry. So there are a number of things that I wanted to title this, what the IRA has done, what we hope the IRA is going to do, and what the IRA hasn't done. The legal people at JP Morgan said I couldn't do that, but I'm gonna say that's what it is. So what the IRA has done was drastically increase the supply and the diversity of credits. Just by way of example, before the passage of the IRA in 2022, you could get a 30% tax credit on a solar project. And just to give context of really what that means, if you develop and build and own a solar project that costs $100 million, you get a tax credit. You get to write off $30 million from your tax bill. The problem is most renewables developers don't have a $30 million tax bill, thus introducing the concept of tax equity, which my cousin Doug is going to talk about in a little bit. But so that introduces the need for tax equity and various tax structures to monetize all of these incentives that have come in through the industry. So the supply, huge supply of tax credits through the adders, the diversity of tax credits. By way of example, there is now a tax credit for standalone storage projects, which didn't exist before that. Across a number, there's a technology agnostic tax credit that's coming into effect. By virtue of these tax credits, it's significantly increased the economic benefit to developers and owners of these projects. And in a lot of instances, it has given projects, kind of gotten them over the economic hump. In a lot of instances, before the advent of a storage tax credit, standalone storage projects would not have been economically feasible. They now are. It's increased the visibility and the stability of the tax credit regime. Before the passage of the IRA, just about every 2 years, like clockwork, there was this concern: are the tax credits going to expire? Are they going to sunset? Are they going to step down? Are they going to sunset? Is a new administration going to cancel all of the tax credits? That's another conversation that we can talk about if we need to. But this has given us really significant visibility into what the tax incentive regime is going to be for the foreseeable future. And it's introduced alternative methods of monetizing tax credits, mostly in the form of being able to transfer credits to a third party or receiving the credits in the form of direct pay in certain instances. What we hope the IRA will do for renewables is deepen the market for tax credit buyers and investors. So we have $369 billion of tax credits that can be harvested. The actual number is going to be much higher than that. But now you need folks with $369 billion of tax appetite. JP Morgan and Bank of America together historically have made up a little over half of the tax equity market. JP Morgan and Bank of America don't have $200 billion of tax appetite. And so the question is going to be, who are the new investors coming into this market to help monetize and incentivize the development of these renewables projects? We hope that it's going to establish a domestic supply chain. We get calls almost every other day from folks who are developing, intending to build domestic solar cell module wafer manufacturing facilities, racking facilities, the entire supply chain. It's going to take some time. I think everybody is cautiously optimistic that that market will establish itself, but it's going to take time. And lastly, we hope that the IRA and the intent of the IRA is to accelerate the commercialization of new technology, advanced nuclear projects, accelerating hydrogen applications. A couple notable things what the IRA hasn't done. It's not made financing any simpler. I think a lot of folks were hoping that it was going to simplify the financing for renewables. Tax equity still exists, and it's complex. It's actually made it more complex because now you have hybrid tax equity structures and all of these different optionality for how you finance a project. And what it also hasn't done is taken away some of the industry bottlenecks, namely permitting is a huge problem. Senator Manchin, among others, are working on trying to solve that. And it hasn't solved the interconnection queue. If you think of where solar and wind projects are being developed, it's where land is flat and abundant and cheap. West Texas, eastern North Carolina, where not many people live other than in the Triangle. And so the problem is getting the power from where it's generated to where it needs to get to. And you have a lot of NIMBYism, not in my backyard, folks not wanting transmission lines through their backyard to get the power to where it needs to go. The IRA hasn't really solved that. Just touching quickly, the IRA has far and away been the most impactful legislation for the renewables industry since the renewables industry was in existence. In the 10 years since I've been doing it, it's changed quite a bit. Projects have gotten much, much bigger. There was a period in time in North Carolina where people were building 5-megawatt solar projects over and over again as fast as you could, and it was a great time to do that. Now projects are 500 megawatts, 100 times bigger just in the course of a couple years. The industry has established itself as a proper institutionalized infrastructure class. It's become global. Most of the lenders that we compete with are international project finance banks. And so it's grown immensely. It's become global. And I think my personal opinion, and I think the consensus is it will continue to grow at a pretty rapid pace and just become a more integral part of our infrastructure landscape.
Thanks, John. So Doug, can you just share what type of deal structures and projects you work with at Key Financial?
Sure.
You're on.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm glad John claimed me as his cousin. I didn't think he would, so hopefully we got that out of the way. But similar to what John's doing at JP Morgan, I work for Key Bank. We're a 200-year-old bank, kind of a traditional bank operating in a non-traditional space. Where they're doing larger utility scale, we're doing smaller distributed generation. And for us, that's anywhere from, say, like 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts of solar. We're also doing fuel cell financing, solar plus storage, standalone storage, and energy efficiency. So our product primarily is a sale leaseback, where we buy the project from the developer and we lease it back to them. And so what that allows us to do is to, as a tax owner of the project, take the tax benefits of the investment tax credit and the depreciation plus the debt and factor that into our financing. So that allows us to do smaller projects, anywhere from, say, a 5 megawatt on a capped landfill to we're doing a series of 50 projects in Massachusetts where we're trying to lump together 7 or 8 projects on school top roofs and municipal buildings. Similar to John's experience and kind of building on what he said is that before the IRA, the ITC was stepping down. It was 30%, went down to 26, and was going down. And so as a bank, we were trying to shift our business model to accommodate that because there was so much uncertainty. So we added a whole nother energy efficiency business because that really didn't depend on ITC. I was primarily still focused on solar ITC, but we had another group of people that were doing just energy efficiency. So the IRA has changed all that. It's provided a lot more certainty. We still have the energy efficiency business, but we're able to capture not just 30%, but 40 and 50%, and sometimes there's more within our sale leaseback projects for the smaller distributed generation projects, which are more energy generated at the source where it's needed. So it's a little bit different approach, but it kind of adds to the same type of mindset for dealing with the IRA.
Okay. So something that, John, that you said, you talked about some of the challenges in managing issues with projects. And so I have a background, I did some independent engineering work. And so a lot of the work we did was focused on risk management. And so Bonnie actually knows this area quite well. And so Bonnie, can you share with me some of the work about managing risk and how we do risk mitigation and facilitation for some of these projects?
Sure. So I think the first thing is to identify what risk is and to comment that risk is not bad. Risk just is, and you have to decide, do you want it, and who wants it, and how much you're willing to pay to get rid of it. But I think most people think of risk and you think of natural catastrophe and you think of, trade risk, or you think of a technology risk that something's going to fail. But the risk encompasses all of the pieces of the financing. So it's everything from supply chain coming from overseas. It incorporates whether or not the timing of the supply chain is going to be there. Is the product going to work? Is it delivered properly? It comes out around trade risk. So our conversations with China or relations with China are going to sour, which is going to potentially threaten your supply chain or shorten your supply chain. Is there a drought in Panama, which means you can't get ships through the Panama Canal at full capacity? And it's all the way through kind of your traditional pieces that you think about with insurance of natural catastrophe or credit risks or things like that. But you also have so much more to it. And with every new technology and all of the new uncertainty, every time you have something new and uncertainty, then there's risk and you have to think about it. So we love to think about the fact that there's a holistic approach to this. How do you think about it from an early stage all the way through? So you have things like, as was mentioned, the interconnections are getting longer. The projects are getting bigger. They're getting more costly. So what are we doing and what are the new products that solve that problem for developers? So for example, there's the ability to use a surety bond now in lieu of a letter of credit. So instead of you having to put cash down as a deposit for your project, you're now able to rent somebody else's balance sheet. So somebody else puts the cash down, you rent it, you borrow it, and when the project gets financed and is approved, then it all comes around and it goes well, theoretically. But there's a lot of these transactions that occur every day that have some sticky parts to it. So part of what our team looks at is where do we get rid of some of these sticky parts? So with the new hybrid structures, with the adders, with the different pieces that are unusual to these, there's an ability for us to look at and try and remove that risk to make so say you're doing a solar project and you think you're on a brownfield to brightfield, but it's not in one of the clearly defined energy community areas, but it should qualify, but you're not sure. There's an ability for you to create a product that will surround that and remove that risk so that when you go to your financing partner, you're getting better terms. You're able to move faster because you've taken the uncertainty or the long-term issues out of the project. And this it goes across the whole spectrum. So it's everything from how do you design, so if you're building in West Texas or you're building somewhere with hail, how do you think about our severe convective storms? How do you think about how to design it better so that it's cheaper to do the remediation when you're in design mode and it costs you maybe a cent a watt versus once you've built it and you now have this problem and to remediate it then costs you an inordinate amount of money that doesn't make sense. We also are really looking at all the different places that we can solve financing. So we look at technology risk. You mentioned that you're looking at fuel cells and carbon capture. One of the things that we look at is how do we wrap the bankability? So if this company goes bankrupt and your fuel cell is supposed to last for 10 years, somebody's money is in place to support that product for the remainder of its life. And or if they have a performance guarantee that they're supposed to be able to perform at a certain level. Hydrogen's a big one on this. Are they going to meet their efficiency targets? You typically will size this so that the revenue is protected. So if we have a wonderful lender who's doing our debt service, that we can always make sure we pay our debt service. And it's a way to make sure, especially on the early stage projects and the early stage technologies, carbon capture, all the hydrogen projects, et cetera, that there's ways to do it. We look at things across carbon capture is measurement and verification. How do you measure it? How do you make sure it's there? How do you make sure it's there all the time? What do you think about if you're doing natural storage and your forest burns down? What do you think about if you are taking carbon and you're injecting it into an old well? And how are you measuring that it's not escaping? And how do you have somebody that's demonstrating it enough that you can go to the IRS and say this is the truth? And I think that's one of the bigger risks that people are looking at around the tax credits, around wage and apprentice, because that's still very vague, is not just, I think my project makes this, but how do I go all the way through to where the IRS is going to come back and accuse me of not having done it, and how do I, A, have all the paperwork in place? Because let's be honest, a lot of people don't do a great, I don't know about anybody else, I keep 7 years of taxes, but you know, the fact that most developers would have to keep 10, 12 years of taxes or of records, that starts getting very cumbersome. So it's a question of the diligence around record keeping, not just around is your product working, is it doing what it's supposed to do, such that it can withstand an IRS defense, and you can think about getting in front of the IRS and having support to defend that. We know that it's coming. We don't know when. Probably in a couple of years.
It's coming now. We're feeling the pressure on that now. Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of opportunities around this. And it's fun to look at the new risks. And every time there's a new product, a new structure, there's a new opportunity for us to think about how to make the financiers more comfortable, to make the technology more bankable so that we can move the energy transition faster.
I know we talked about, the clean energy financing through the IRA, but there are some costs that aren't covered through the ITC. And so site control is such a critical part of any renewable project. As many of you who are developers know, you've got to have the site secured before you can move forward with anything else. And so, Gage, can you kind of share the work that Renewa does to offer some security and options for capital for developers and landowners?
Sure, happy to do that. So I'm a proud Tar Heel. If anybody wants to stream the game, I'm fine with that. Just
Me too. So I support that.
Yeah. My name is Gage Mooring. I'm a co-CEO of Renewa, and to Rice's question and point, one area that got no love from the IRA was land cost. If you don't have site control, you don't have a place to put your project, renewable transition is not going to happen. I don't care who you talk to. 250 million acres is what we're going to need to achieve net zero by 2050. So that's 5 or 6 states of land that typically has alternative use, existing use. And so what we do at Renewa is we partner with developers and landowners to acquire and provide capital for assuring site control. As these guys were mentioning, the queues are a mess. And what is often impossible for different developers to time up is, okay, I need this site, I need an option on it for 3 to 5 years. Hopefully I get everything I need in place. I get my offtake, I get my EPC, I get my interconnection agreement. 9 times out of 10, Murphy's Law comes into play, right? And they run out of time. And so what we do at Renewa is we're really the other part of the capital stack that's not shown through, some of the things that John and these guys were talking about. And so just to, expense my flight from Texas, just a quick couple slides on Renewa. We started the company about 3 years ago. We really saw a niche in the market to be that capital solution for site control, as I mentioned. How this ties into the IRA is when we started this company in about a year, we were in 5 states, 37 projects. Fast forward to the IRA passing, 2 years later, we're in 30 states, 175 projects across the U.S. The need for land capital is growing immensely, especially given the lack of support through the IRA and the ITC and PTC credit. So just a quick overview of where we're at. Heavily focused on where renewable development has taken place. Right, think Wind Alley up through the central U.S., California, ERCOT. But as these guys mentioned, is hopefully queue reform happens, transmission becomes solved, hopefully over the next coming decade, to get power to market. You're going to see this map grow. And I think one thing I wanted to touch on is really the difference between site control in far west Texas for utility scale solar farm versus site control for standalone battery storage, DG community solar. So the ability to option land for 5 years is practically impossible if you think about urban centers. So there's a need to acquire land well ahead of NTP. And if you think about land cost as a percentage of your development capital, just fast forwarding here, West Texas, 10 to 20% max of your total, development cost. Best, that number's approaching 50% for standalone storage in urban areas. So there's a huge need for continued support in order for the energy transition to take place, and that's really a gap that we hope to fill at Renua.
So speaking about standalone storage, I'm just curious, outside of the cost difference with standalone storage, I guess this would be Bonnie, you engaged, what are some other risks that you are seeing or you could think about for standalone storage development in the future? Because obviously that's, where we're seeing growth in the industry right now as well, a lot more standalone storage.
Sure. So I think that we've started identifying kind of your traditional things. You've got your technology risk, you've got your environmental risk. What are you doing around that? You've got a lot of things around proximity to assets. You've got proximity to population centers. You've got spacing around your storage assets. Do you have the proper spacing? Do you have the proper mitigation plans in place? So I think what you're seeing is a lot of education and comfort on the risk side of the world in terms of getting more comfortable around batteries and getting more comfortable around the different battery technologies and the fact that there's more coming. I think the risk, if you're looking at it for residential solar, is much more challenging. I think if you're looking at it from, behind the meter CNI as well, you have a different portfolio of risks that you're looking at due to the proximity to the buildings and or to, especially on the resi side, to the occupied spaces. But I think what you're seeing is this expansion of it and a coming understanding where more entities are willing to entertain it, look at it, and need less hand-holding through this process.
Yeah, and from our perspective, risk is always associated with site control, right? You lose that site control, you're starting from scratch, right? All your work on your PPA and your environmental kind of goes away. So ensuring that site control is achieved is one of the biggest risks in any development. And so us, at Renua, that's really where we're helping to mitigate that risk across the board for developers, especially in BESS, given where these projects are located. And as Bonnie mentioned, a lot of these sites are located former industrial properties, right? They're located near load, near housing developments. Fire's a big concern, right, with a lot of battery storage developers, but I think a lot of great work's been done kind of across this panel, I know, to mitigate those risks as much as possible.
I think the other one I forgot is supply chain. The energy storage market is growing so fast that the penalties for being late to bring your project to bear, for late delivery of supply chain, is something that is very real, and depending on relations with China will get even more real. So I think what you're seeing is a lot of supply chain risk is one of the biggest pieces that we are seeing. So we're looking at it from a trade credit perspective. We're looking at it from damages for not being on time for commissioning or not being on time for delivery of product. So there's a lot of opportunities, but that supply chain, and as you're speaking, everybody wants domestic supply. We're hoping it gets there faster, but this is really something that we hope goes faster because this is one of the biggest risks right now we see.
Yep.
I'd add to that, and with solar, with just solar, it's predictable amount of revenue generation. With storage, it's intermittent and the revenue is variable. So we have a real hard time as a finance company being able to finance that and underwriting the risk for that. So it's another challenge with standalone storage. If you've got a fixed rate contract with storage, that's much easier than when you have a variable rate it's intermittently generated or intermittently used.
Yeah. So how has the business changed for your large tax equity since the passage of the IRA, or even just financing in general with your investors? I guess that would be you, Doug and John.
Yeah, I think, like I had mentioned, there are new structures that exist now with the passage of the IRA. Traditional tax equity most often manifests itself in what's called a partnership flip. Effectively, if we, JP Morgan, are the tax equity investor, we take an ownership stake in the solar project, storage project, wind project. We own it. Majority own the project for 5 years. We can harvest the tax credits, the depreciation, and then after that 5 years, there's the IRS effectively allows you to sell the project, or your ownership can flip to a minority stake, and then we'll sell the project. That structure still exists and is still the primary structure that the large tax equity investors will transact in. JP Morgan, Bank of America, US Bank, and others. The advent of transferability allows you, if you're a developer, to take your 30% credit and go sell it to a third party who wants to buy it without having the complexity of a tax equity structure, whether it's a partnership flip, inverted lease, sale leaseback. And so that has been a new muscle for a lot of tax equity investors. And then in the middle, there's what is called a hybrid structure, where you still have a partnership, but if JP Morgan were the investor in that partnership, you contractually have the ability, we, JP Morgan, have the ability to compel the owner of the project to go transfer the credit to a third party. What we're hearing is that almost every partnership flip that is executed now has the flexibility to be a hybrid structure. So if JP Morgan is investing as the tax equity investor, the documents will say we have the option to cause the project to transfer the credits to Microsoft, Google, Amazon, whoever has a tax bill that wants to buy the credits. That vehicle is necessarily going to have to be how the tripling or quadrupling of the tax credit market will come to pass. And I think that's the consensus of what needs to happen to meet our net zero goals and to harvest all of the benefits that are coming out of the IRA. So the structures have become more diverse. They haven't been simplified, as I mentioned, and it's given, especially for traditional tax equity investors, it's given us a new tool to use. Large banks have banked the preponderance of the corporates in America, and so what we've been working to do is identify which of our corporate clients have a tax bill and that don't want to have a tax bill anymore, and introducing the concept of tax credit transfers or tax equity and credit transfers to try to build that market. And that transfer market has to build in order to meet all of the ambitious goals that we've set.
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of the same things that John has said. I think another dynamic with the IRA is that demand has increased sharply, and just like JP Morgan, Bank of America, KeyBank has limited amount of tax appetite, and so we're burning through that at a much faster rate now. And so we're using the same type of idea of selling the tax credits or being able to transfer those tax credits. We already have within our real estate group low-income housing tax credit group that's been selling low-income housing tax credits. They're going to use the same platform to do that for us, so that we have that kind of safety valve. If we take on a project that requires tax equity, we run out of our own tax equity, we can always sell that. It's probably going to affect the economics of the transaction, but at least it gives us a safety valve to do that.
I think you're also seeing a huge market for I don't know if this one's on. There we go. For the family offices coming in, I think you're seeing a lot more of that. And it's a really interesting time because as this expansion is occurring and we're watching it occur, you have a different class of investor or a different type of investor that wants to invest in carbon credits. It's a less well-known product. The hydrogen credits are going to be a very different product for people because it's got more risk and more uncertainty to it. We're still not done with the regulations on that one. And that I think depending on which class you're looking at, it'll be different. But I do think the new investor classes have different risk profiles. Some of them are willing to take more risk. Some of them have less risk. A lot of the ESG-driven investors are a very different product and a very different appetite than what you would see out of traditional financing.
Yeah. So The IRA also provided another opportunity. A lot of the assets I managed early on in my career, some of them might be looking to decommissioning. Well, now we've shifted that. Now there's opportunity for financing for retooling and repowering and things like that. So how are we, and anyone can answer this, how are we looking at some of the risk opportunities for extending or longer project useful lives and things like that?
Yeah, from our perspective, the value of the interconnection, the plug into the grid, is one of the most key elements to any project. And any old project is going to have that ability. You're going to avoid the Q cluster, right? And we see repowering as a huge ability to take a lot of the old wind projects in particular. Some older solar projects are all primed to be repowered over the next 5 to 10 years. And really what that's going to do is take a useful life that was 20 to 35 years and extend it another, potentially 20 years. And so I think you're going to continue to see that be a theme from a lot of developers. And from our perspective, it's really a win-win, right? It gives us as landowners the ability to extend the contract that we have. And it gives the developers the ability to extend the useful life and therefore the revenues from a project.
Any other questions? I want to take some time to turn it to the audience. I don't know if any of our audience members had questions. We can get a microphone to you. I see one right here. If you need a mic, I can grab one. Oh, there is one. Oh, see. That's so good. There we go. I think it's on. He'll turn it on for us.
Testing. So my question was maybe going to build on, after the repowering, these projects are eventually going to reach end of life and decommissioning. I'd be curious how the financing is looking at solar panels, those recovery, the batteries. There's a cost, there's a bit of a risk in transport, and how that's done from a financing package as well as potentially the risk, and how you think about those.
I'll start there and let Bonnie jump in here. But as landowners, in every lease, we're going to have the developer is going to have the requirement to take that land back to its original use, and that can mean a lot of different things. And you're talking a long time in the future. So as an area that Bonnie focuses on is really who's going to fund that, who's going to pay for it, and that's important for us as land investors because we're applying a terminal valuation to every piece of land that we buy, and that could be cropland in Illinois all the way to a site in Long Island that's primed for a distribution center. So for us, the assuredness that somebody's going to be there to pay for it is huge as a landowner.
So we actually look at this every day, all the time, and we look at the recycling of this every day, all the time. So in particular for decommissioning, as a general rule, again, developers tend not to have very large balance sheets. They tend not to have the ability to park cash. So again, we have products that are in place where developers or whoever the owner is can actually put a bond in place that holds that cash in reserve for the decommissioning period. Sometimes it'll change in value depending on if the regulations change, things like that. But it's typically somebody borrowing somebody else's balance sheet to hold that place so that you can come all the way through, because developers need to take their cash and do something useful with it and not just hold it in reserve. They need to be growing and doing more. The other piece you mentioned, the solar panel recycling, we are seeing huge amounts of that finally coming through. We've got multiple options now. So again, on the insurance front, if we have a hail damage, storm damage, et cetera, we actually have entities that we've got contracts with to take the panels away, to do panel removal, recycling, et cetera, to make sure that these projects are being handled in a responsible way. There used to be maybe 2 options, and now there's 4, 5, 6, 7 of them. So it's been great in the last 2 to 3 years to see that side of it really come around.
And I think, on the turbine side of things, we see it every day in Texas. They're taking these massive turbines and literally burying them in the ground, right? And so we're working on recycling options. By we, I mean people much smarter than me are working on recycling options, and they're coming, but we need more of them. And we need more of them. And I think for batteries, John and I are actually working on a deal where you're seeing the salvage value of batteries after the useful life actually cover that decommissioning cost in many cases, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, if you don't know about Redwood Materials, that's J.B. Straubel, who's the former CTO of Tesla, has now started a new company that they're doing all the recycling of the batteries, and they have an amazing project, and they're breaking ground on their second project out here, right? I think it's in South Carolina. So,
Any other questions?
it's called Redwood Materials. And it's the CTO there it's a group of former Tesla folks.
I was just wondering, how do you all navigate the risk of engaging with and depending on the IRA in a kind of unstable political landscape? Like, how does that transform how you deal with these really important provisions if they might not be as consistent as we want them to be?
That's a great question, and one that we've been fielding a lot. The question is effectively, if there's an administration change in November, what happens? I think collectively, the market, and we spend a ton of time in Washington as a firm, what we're hearing is that the risk that there's just a wholesale repeal of the IRA is extraordinarily low. And I had a slide that I opted not to use, but if you look at the investment that has been triggered by the IRA, the majority of it has been in red states. Not the vast majority, but a clear majority. If you think of where renewables is being developed, Wind Alley, the Southeast, a lot of the manufacturing has been established in the Southeast, and so it would be politically challenging. It would be challenging from a litigation standpoint. There have been tens of billions of dollars of investment on the back of the IRA. If anything, if the Trump administration were to try to enact or extend some of the tax cuts that they had enacted in 2017, there's talk that they may take some provisions of the IRA on the fringes and eliminate those to help pay for the extension of the tax cuts. But the risk of the core tenets of the IRA, speaking specifically in the renewables industry, is pretty low. If there were to be provisions of the IRA repealed under a Trump administration, historically in such a situation, there have been safe harbor rules where if you enter into a binding contract before the first act of Congress to facilitate the elimination of whatever provision it is, you're kind of safe harbored into that. But again, a wholesale repeal of the IRA, I don't know that there's any real concern of it.
I think at least on the hydrogen side, you also have to think about the amount of investment and or political sway from Europe that desperately needs the green hydrogen, as well as Japan. There's a number of countries that are coming to the United States to build green hydrogen facilities for export, and that's a real driver.
Yeah, I mean, we deal with landowners every day, and a lot of the red states, you think about where these assets are built, it's again, West Texas, it's the Southeast. There's so much money that's really changing communities through the IRA and through renewable development. If you're a farmer that's used to dealing with commodity swings every year, having that assuredness of revenue from a renewable project is huge. It's life-changing. And so I think that even where you think you would get pushback from red states, it's really just been such a boon for a lot of people who are really struggling that I don't see it being totally repealed, as John was saying.
I'd add to that, there are a lot of state-level policies that continued through the step-down of the ITC before that did support solar. I mean, they were primarily in blue states where there's a lot of political support for clean energy, and that kind of carried a lot of those projects through anyway.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Right here, this young man right here, fourth row.
Thank you so much. My question was a little bit more on other parts of the IRA. So, specifically, I think a lot of it has been really pushing towards trying to make the USA, a player when it comes to manufacturing and things like that. Like you all said, a lot of those jobs have been seen in the Southeast, which is great. I guess I wanted to hear from you all what you all thought in terms of from what you've seen so far, whether you think we can be a competitive player in terms of the manufacturing part of it, and I think specifically whether we can be price competitive, especially when it comes to solar panels and things like that.
I don't know yet. I don't know that we know yet. The build out of a lot of these manufacturing facilities are still just happening. What we found is they're very hard to finance. If you're not for solar, and you can't finance a $400 million plant on your balance sheet, the financing options to build out a lot of these facilities is somewhat limited, outside of just a $400 million equity investment from somebody. With the incentives that exist, renewables components can be cost competitive with foreign manufactured components, absent incentives from a competing country that artificially decreases the cost of those components. You have all of the tariffs and outright prohibitions of imports of solar panels from China for a number of reasons: forced labor, anti-dumping, just artificially lowering the prices. And so what you could see is just if we, the United States, come in at a certain price, China incentivizes their manufacturing to undercut that, and then you end up in a trade war, which is where we find ourselves today. So it's a very complex dynamic, but I think that we will find in relatively short order a domestic supply chain. Is it going to supply 100% of our domestic needs? No. But I think that we will have a domestic supply chain that just didn't exist at all before the passage of the IRA.
On a different segment, so if you look at the electrolyzer side and you look at the hydrogen side, so much of this is new technology. So Europe's definitely got a bit of a head start on us on some of those pieces. But I think what we are seeing is a huge amount of investment in new technology here. And because everybody's kind of growing at an exponential rate, the ability to do it here in the United States around the advanced manufacturing is really capable. And I think you're seeing the same thing around some of the carbon capture, either the point source or the direct air capture. Every day I talk to a new entity that is doing one of those two things and trying to figure out how to help them grow faster.
This is for Doug and whoever else has a perspective. Can you talk a little bit more about direct pay and how that's made local governments think differently about solar? Is it pushing them to do it? Has it made it cheaper? And what financing looks like for the other half of it?
Yeah, good question. We haven't seen a whole lot of activity with entities that previously could not use absorb because they're tax exempt, they couldn't use that. We haven't seen a lot of activity. Some municipalities have approached us with that, and we can do things like tax exempt financing in conjunction with that. We really haven't seen a whole lot of activity there yet, but we do expect that to, as tax exempt entities get a little bit more experience with that. But then again, they also may not want that experience. A lot of those budgets are stretched and they don't have the people that are able to do that. So they rely on developers to absorb the tax credits themselves and kind of do the more traditional PPA financings. We just haven't seen much activity around it yet.
I think maybe California is slightly different because we have the community choice aggregators. Yeah. So in the world of, as my boss calls it, the People's Republic of California, the community choice aggregators are kind of an alternative entity to the utilities. And what you are seeing is they are procuring all of their own generation, and they are very concerned about generation that is locally capable and locally available, as opposed to being brought in via transmission lines. I'm sure everybody's aware of the fire issues that California has had. So the value being placed on local generation as opposed to generation that's in the Central Valley or somewhere else has been increasing, and the community choice aggregators or the other entities that need to be able to provide this are actually using it. And what we're hearing, I don't know if this is the case, but when I talk to them, they're saying that to get rid of the more complex ITC type structures, they're able to do it at almost a 20% discount to a traditional tax equity investment structure.
and I think if you look at the mansion provision, right, of the IRA and the communities, right, where former coal communities, former coal counties, you're seeing a lot of investment. You're getting additional uplift on your ITC credit, but it's also you're having decommissioning coal plants, right, and so there's an interconnection there. So that's a huge, next step in not only battery storage but also solar is taking those old interconnections associated with coal plants and taking advantage of your ITC credit.
A lot of folks are building their business around that. Existing interconnections, retiring traditional generation, and putting batteries and renewables at those interconnection points.
Same thing with hydrogen.
Hi, how do you identify which risks are prioritized when you kind of go through the process of risk management, especially thinking of certain marginalized communities that don't have the capital to be at the forefront of lobbying groups or investment groups?
Tell me a little bit more. So you're worrying most about the impacted communities and kind of the social justice aspect of it?
How
Okay.
do you still kind of represent their interests and make sure that in clean energy financing that these groups aren't being ignored?
So I think actually the direct pay part of it is part of what's really helping that. So, for example, there's a company called Grid Alternatives that does projects in California and a number of other, a couple other locations. And I know there's other entities like that. I'm most familiar with Grid Alternatives. And what they do is because of the direct pay, they previously had to do some kind of a PPA structure and try and figure out how to move it through that way. And instead, they're now shifting to doing their own direct pay financing. And Grid Alternatives is different in the sense that they bring the community with them. So they do job training, and they're utilizing wage and apprenticeship benefits to be able to help support that. So they do a lot of work in bringing forward and partnering to do more work around electricians, around construction opportunities, around training for their communities, so that the people that are building those assets in the socially necessary areas are also being the ones that are caring for their own. So they're building it first in their own communities, they're caring for their own communities, and then they're expanding out into the rest. So they have two sides of their business, that one side is for their communities, with their communities, so they own and operate them and educate them, and then they also have a business that is outside of that.
There are also incentives to include low-income people in community solar projects. We're doing some projects in Massachusetts now that have a low-income component where they're getting an additional incentive to include low-income people. There's Massachusetts, New York also has that, and a variety of other states, just because those type of people are being left out of these projects mainly.
Also, each of the big hydrogen hubs had to include a social and community development plan, and that was a really big change and a really big difference, that each of the major hubs had to include that kind of a community-based investment and engagement in their applications.
Well, thank you, everyone. This was a wonderful panel. Thank you, John, Doug, Bonnie, Gage. It was wonderful hearing from you all. Thank you to the audience for all your questions. And that ends our session. Have a good rest of your day. You can stay in here and hear the next presentation.